And hit record. Okay, hi everybody, welcome. I'm pleased to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Stephanie Batchelor. Stephanie graduated from Wells in 1979 with a degree in economics, went on to earn a law degree from the Walter F. George School of Law at Mercer University in Georgia. She is currently a senior staff attorney with the New York State Defenders Association. Since 1998, she has been with the association's nonprofit Public Defense Backup Center, where she helps develop client-centered representation training strategies for new public defense practitioners. Stephanie's professional practice interests are centered around trauma-informed advocacy and secondary trauma. Her extensive specialized trainings in criminal defense and racial justice have been recognized as hallmarks of the innovative educational efforts she undertakes with the legal organizations throughout the country. When she received the Wells College Alumni Award last year, one of her peers praised Stephanie's collaborative nature, saying that her ability to recognize others' ideas and build upon them, as well as her own, have broadened the availability of quality training for public defenders. In doing so, she has helped to promote positive systemic change and cultural equity in her field. Stephanie, we're so glad to welcome you here tonight. And one more item before we get started is I'd like to read the Wells College Cayuga Land Acknowledgement. Wells College recognizes our collective responsibility to acknowledge our colonial history. This land is the traditional land of the Cayuga Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Wells College commits itself to ensuring the traditions and cultures of Indigenous peoples are embraced and reflected upon in order to engage in solidarity with the Cayuga Nation. Thank you so much. And on that note, I'd like to hand it over to Stephanie.
Thank you, Emily. And what a beautiful sentiment. I love that you start with that statement of our ancient roots at Wells College. That's really wonderful. And hi, everybody. Thank you, Emily, when we were getting everything together. I got to say, I'm a little nervous. Community was in the dining hall when I went and picked up the microphone and I was announcing a party at Pettibone. So times have changed and here I am giving a talk on something a little bit more serious, but one that I hope you will enjoy and appreciate some of the things that, that we'll be talking about this evening. I do have a PowerPoint up. I've got some notes in front of me, so I'm going to try and bounce between the two and keep us going. We talked about doing questions. Please feel free to toss questions into the chat. I may or may not see the bubble come up. Emily and Rachel are going to marshal them for me. I'm hoping to get done at a time when we can have a conversation afterwards. Even if we run a little bit late, I can stay. If you have something that comes up that's related to something I just said, please, they'll jump in and ask me to clarify. So it's a big topic that I thought of to talk about today. It's a relatively simple concept, but they are complex issues that we're talking about. So I'm going to be talking about broad strokes, some introduction to some ideas as we address the idea of empowering justice and transforming public legal services. I'm going to start talking about public defense as we traditionally consider it in criminal defense. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about public legal services in the sense of the civil court arena. And then I'm going to divert a little bit to talk about human rights and the protection of rights, human rights, as we know them and as perhaps we have to think about them in the courts and the legal system. And then finally, I'm going to tie it into activism because that's what this week is all about. And in many ways, that's what public defenders do and public legal service providers do. We are activists for justice. I do want to preface this to note that while all forms of racism and ethnic and gender bigotry and other forms of discrimination and systems that create abuse or systemic and systematic abuse. I'm sorry, I'm trying to read notes and talk to y'all. are woven into this the system and require some change. But I'm actually focusing on economic marginalization, which embraces everyone. The argument is that if the awesome power of the government is going to be used to deprive any person of any aspect of health, education, welfare, life, liberty, or property, and they can't afford to hire a lawyer should be provided. And I'll be examining the gaps in the current system where that exists, with the idea that racism, ethnic and gender bigotry, and other forms of discrimination and systemic and systematic abuse are part and parcel of economic marginalization in our community. And I also want to note, give you a soapbox warning, a heads up. This is in many ways, I carry a soapbox. This is what I do. This is what I believe. This is my mission. It was my calling to go into public defense. These are views shared within my world. Again, I'm talking about broad strokes. A little bit of a disclaimer, or at least an admission. I'm a globalist. I believe in publicly funded infrastructures and systems for the shared benefit of the community, especially where public welfare and human rights are concerned. I'm a zealous advocate, even though zealousness is no longer part of the ethical standard in the rules of professional conduct. And I'm very much aware of my privilege and have strived throughout my life and career to pay it forward, to use my privilege to help others who don't have that privilege, who are underserved and less privileged. The Sixth Amendment to the United States Constitution. This is the foundation of what I do. This is one of the several amendments related to our protection from the government, especially when it comes to criminal prosecutions. And it is specific to, in criminal prosecutions, it's the right to speedy trial, it's the right to public trial, it's the right to compulsory process, to subpoena witnesses, and then finally to have the assistance of counsel for a person's defense, his defense, but all of our defense. And to borrow a phrase, to be a Sixth Amendment lawyer, to be a lawyer who works under the mandate of the Sixth Amendment, we are liberty's last champion. That's the motto of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. Because the mandate is clear that a lawyer assigned under the Sixth Amendment, our mandate, our job, our role is to protect a person from the awesome power of the government if life, liberty, and property are in question. And we are sometimes that last person, that last champion, that last advocate that a person has. It's a mandate. It's considered an unfunded mandate. It's certainly an underfunded mandate in many jurisdictions. There's sometimes a political resentment that public funds are used to pay for legal services for the poor. Gets lumped in with wasteful government spending, as so many social justice programs do. But the right to the assistance of counsel in a criminal prosecution can be traced back to the Magna Carta. It's included in the Geneva Convention, so it's an important right and it's a long-lived right. Some of you may know Gideon versus Wainwright. This was the case that changed the landscape for the Sixth Amendment in public defense in criminal cases. Clarence Gideon was convicted and imprisoned for a misdemeanor in Florida without the assistance of counsel. He wrote the Supreme Court. He asked for assistance. Some of you may know the case. Some of you may know the book, Gideon's Trumpet. It was written by Anthony Lewis in 1964. Some of you may know the movie where Henry Fonda played Clarence Gideon. It is such a landmark case. This is the front page of his petition. It was 5 pages, handwritten in his best printing. You can see that he was trying to capture the attention of the United States Supreme Court, trying to ask why it was that people who have money can have the assistance of counsel and people who don't necessarily have the right, even though it seems to be in the Constitution. It was a tiny voice that changed the vision and changed the face of justice. When we think about the power, the awesome power of the government, the courts are one of the 3 branches, I'm sure everyone knows, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, equal branches of government. Gideon versus Wainwright was the court case that finally ushered in the fulfillment of the constitutional guarantee. Defenders, that it models a way that the courts can be used in order to ensure rights. Defenders such as myself in both the civil and criminal arenas work within the judicial system to find ways to use the courts to help us protect rights. And you can probably all see this. You know, it's funny. I'm going to change my my view here because I can't really read the screen. I'll come back and hopefully I'll get to see everybody afterwards. Courts are often used to control and oppress people, and not just in the criminal arena. And the power of the courts, as I mentioned, the awesome power of the courts is why the Sixth Amendment exists. And the first paragraph there, Shelley versus Kramer, was a case in which the Supreme Court noted that judicial enforcement of any law, rule, covenant, or regulation, however private, should not be allowed unless the party aggrieved is assured the assistance of qualified, competent, and zealous legal counsel. Shelley versus Kramer was a case where it was a private development, housing development. You'll see it goes back to 1948, where the rules of the development were that they could not sell property to Negroes, to Black people. And they went to court to try and enforce that rule, that agreement. And in Shelley versus Kramer, the court says no. You know, it's one thing if you can accomplish that privately, we may not be able to step in and do anything about it. But if you're going to come into the courts, we're not going to enforce it. And that we should work to find ways to broadly apply that, not just in the criminal arena, but that the courts should not be allowed to oppress people, to control people, to manage people, to prevent people from protecting their lives and their liberty and their property without the assistance of counsel. So this is where we're at. People can be accused of a crime, and we make sure that they have a lawyer. But if it's a civil case, sorry, there's nothing that we can do. And this is a little tongue-in-cheek. It's a shame you're not involved in something criminal. And you can see that the people standing here, one is seeking help in a foreclosure, one is seeking help against domestic abuse, and one is seeking help in a child custody case. And the sad truth is that when without a lawyer, it's possible to be taken into court and face proceedings where children might be taken out of the home. Parental rights might be terminated. There are questions as to housing and eviction. So the movement is often known as movement for civil Gideon. The idea being that we take the right that was granted and enforced after Gideon versus Wainwright, and we open it up and we enforce it in civil proceedings. Not necessarily all civil proceedings, but civil proceedings where there are fundamental interests at stake and basic human needs. Because we know that even though a person might not be charged with a crime, they might lose everything. These are some of the places where that are defined as civil, and that there's no right to the assistance of counsel, no right to the appointment of counsel. Almost any time, if a person can afford to have a lawyer standing next to them, they can have that lawyer standing next to them. But if a person cannot afford to hire a lawyer, then they may be forced to proceed in these proceedings. They may be, forced to go forward. And in eviction and foreclosure and debt collection, where they may not know what their rights are in terms of debt collection, removal from the home in the first instance, pre-filing by Child Protective Services, there's no right to counsel. In immigration proceedings, deportation and removal, grandparents with visitation rights and custody rights in New York have to proceed on their own. Challenges to denials of healthcare, children facing disciplinaries in school. That's an administrative proceeding, I know, but it's an important one. And one where we might want to be thinking about there being access to some to legal advice, if not legal assistance, if not active assistance in the actual proceeding. And then finally, the post-conviction proceedings beyond the direct appeal in a criminal case. Unless there are specific circumstances, the law specifically allows for the assignment of counsel. In the DLRA is the Drug Law Reform Act, when the reform of the Rockefeller drug laws and people were allowed to be resentenced. the statute specifically provided for the assignment of counsel. The DVSJA is the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, another statute in the last couple of years in New York that specifically provided that people who can establish that domestic violence played a significant factor in their conviction, then they can seek resentencing, and specifically they are allowed the assignment of counsel. But beyond that, even where there is evidence of innocence, it's up to the judicial discretion to decide whether or not someone is going to get a lawyer to help them. And if a person doesn't know the law and doesn't have any help, judgments can be filed and you can't recover. Somebody who loses a house, they may never recover. Somebody whose children are taken from their home, somebody who loses their parental rights, they may never recover. The parents may never recover. The family may never recover. And just as a caveat, and we're about to get to this, this is not always the case in all jurisdictions. Again, I'm talking about broad strokes. For example, it's not on this list. The termination of parental rights, as of 2013, 44 states had a right to counsel, the assignment of counsel and a termination of parental rights. But that leaves 16 cases where there are, 6 cases. I went to law school. I'm not a mathematician. 6 states where there is not that right to counsel. And I want to talk a little bit about immigration courts. I put the parentheses around the IM because in many ways in our global community, we should be thinking more about migration and people being able to move freely between countries, crossing borders, especially where their lives are in danger. They need asylum in deportation and removal proceedings. Deportation is classified as a civil proceeding in the federal courts. There is, even though it might feel like a criminal sanction, it might be based on a criminal conviction. There's no right to counsel in these proceedings. And these are, very often we're talking about people who don't speak the language, they don't know the rules. And we're not necessarily talking about people trying to sneak across the border, the southern border. We're talking about people who may have come to this country when they were young and they've lived here for years and they've lived here for decades and they've been, members of a community, and something happens and suddenly they find themselves subject to deportation or removal.
Sorry, while we're on this topic, I got a question where somebody asked if you could speak to the rights of non-citizens, and also just a little fun fact, we have a young alum who is an immigration lawyer in upstate New York, Molly Deacon, class of 2012, if you ever want a connection with her. She spoke at the college last year.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Yeah.
Yes, and the rights of non-citizens, the way our Constitution is written is that it's any person. So when we talk about constitutional rights, we're not talking about just citizens. We're talking about anybody who is within the borders of this country enjoys the guarantees of the rights under the Constitution. But again, when it comes to whether or not there's a right to counsel, and especially in immigration proceedings, we are very often talking about non-citizens who may or may not speak the language. We don't necessarily know how long they've been here, which just adds to the complication and adds to the problem. The legislative fix for the people who have been here since they were children and suddenly may face immigration consequences, that's what DACA is, the Dreamers Act. It's a pathway to citizenship. So people who are in that position aren't necessarily facing deportation and removal. And I put these in here to tug at some heartstrings. It's an extreme vision of some of the things that are happening at the border. These 2 pictures I captured from a video. They are reenactment. It's a reenactment video because cameras are not allowed in courts, but it's what is described as what happens in some of these immigration courts, especially at the borders, where children are facing the immigration judge and they have to answer questions as to why they might need asylum, where they might go, what they might do. And can you imagine being a child just coming into this country, and you can see the man is putting the headphones on so he can, hopefully that's for an interpreter. And And there's no right to counsel, and not even for children. And when it comes to going to court, even for a civil proceeding, if there's something happening, if we're in court and there's something happening, a person has to go because they're facing an eviction. A person has to go because they're facing a foreclosure. A person has to go because something may be happening in their family, and their, the family unit may be in jeopardy. A person may have to go because there's some sort of a question as to a debt, whether or not it needs to be paid, it has been paid, what they might lose if they haven't paid it. This is what it can feel like to walk into a courtroom alone, even in a civil court, if you don't have a lawyer by your side. Even if English is your first language, if you don't know the language of the courts, if you don't know the rules of the courts, a person feels lost and afraid, and can feel very much like a child left alone. And this is one of the reasons that we think about trying to expand the civil right to counsel, this idea of a civil Gideon. And as I mentioned, this isn't to say that there's no help at all for people who may not be able to afford a lawyer. The problem is that it's so underfunded. This slide deals with the Legal Services Corporation, which is a federal not-for-profit, federally funded. They in turn administer funds for other legal aid societies. You may know of legal aid societies who handle civil work around the states, but this is some information related to the woeful underfunding of Legal Services Corporation, and in turn of other legal aid societies that try to handle the civil work. This notes that 60 to 70% of people receive inadequate or no legal assistance in the civil arena. 80% in Boston. In New York, less than 20% of the civil legal needs of low-income families and individuals were met. In 2013, more than 1.8 million litigants went in unrepresented in civil proceedings in New York State. And another thing to note about the Legal Services Corporation is they are subject to draconian income limitations when it comes to who they can provide services for, who their funding agency can provide services to. And the guidelines, they're tied to the federal poverty guidelines, which are not the federal sustainability guidelines. They're the federal poverty guidelines. And a note about that is that when it comes to the Sixth Amendment and Gideon versus Wainwright and the assignment of counsel in a criminal proceeding, the standard is not poverty. The standard is not indigence, despite the fact that those are the words we use in public defense. We talk about indigent defense. The standard is cannot afford to hire counsel. If a person cannot afford to hire counsel to defend him in a criminal proceeding, then he has the right to the assignment of counsel. And when we start thinking about it in terms of poverty and indigence, we start thinking about it in terms of what, for a better description, is a welfare right. And that is not what the right to counsel is. And it carries with it so many more implications. Not that public services aren't important and don't carry severe implications, but we do have to start thinking, and we have to remember, when it comes to the assignment of counsel, we're not talking about poverty. We're talking about inability to hire. And some of that comes into play because in the criminal arena, this is where I talk about the underfunded mandate and the idea of wasteful government spending. We have judges, when they come in and they're qualifying somebody for the assignment of counsel, and they say, well, are you working? Then you don't get the assignment of counsel. And it's not that simple. It's not a matter of, do you have an income? It's, what is that income? And what are the liabilities that you have to face? What are your expenses? Can you really go out into the community and hire a lawyer? And what we have found is that most people, if they are called into court on whatever reason, be it criminal or civil, and on a serious matter, if they can afford a lawyer, they hire a lawyer. If they can't afford a lawyer, then they are there alone, and somebody makes the decision as to whether or not they will get the assistance they need. And I like this quote because it kind of, this is kind of where we are at when we think about who's going to provide legal services for people who can't afford a lawyer in the civil arena. Many of you may know the play, Whoever You Are, I've always depended on the kindness of strangers. Blanche Dubois is being taken into the hospital, and she's addressing that to the orderly in the hospital who's helping her in. And she doesn't know where she is. She doesn't really know what's going on. She is just hoping that, the kindness of strangers will make sure that she's okay. And this is where we're at in many ways when we think about civil services, civil legal services for people who can't afford to hire a lawyer. You may note from the bio, Emily didn't talk about it, but it's in the bio on the page for this. You'll see mentioned that I drafted some amicus curiae, amici curiae briefs in relation to fair compensation for defenders. It was at a time when we were trying to move to get the assigned counsel rates, which are the compensation for lawyers who are assigned to handle cases, independent lawyers, not the institutional providers, not the public defenders, not the legal aid attorneys, but the assigned counsel lawyers under the law. And they were getting paid $40 an hour, not even $40 an hour. And the rates had not gone up for decades. And we were moving to try and see if we could get some court help, right? We were now moving in the courts. We couldn't get the legislature to act to raise the rates. So we were moving in the courts to do something about it. And one of the obstacles that we ran into, and this is a pet peeve of mine, is years ago in the New York Court of Appeals in a case called Werfel v. Agresta. They didn't hold, but they made a sort of a reference to the idea that there's a pro bono aspect to public defense work, suggesting that lawyers who are taking on cases in public defense need to accept short pay, that they can't anticipate or they can't expect fair compensation because they're doing the public good. They're doing a public service. There's this pro bono aspect. But that leaves a lot on the shoulders of the lawyers to learn about the case that they need to learn about, perhaps come up with funds out of their own pockets. If they're not being fairly compensated, then they may not be able to pay their staff. They may not be able to get the money they need to hire an investigator. They may not have the time or the wherewithal to do the kind of research and investigation that it needs. And they're supposed to be in many ways doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. And this is not a way to look at representing people who can't afford to hire a lawyer. It creates such a wide disparity of what kind of representation people who can't afford to hire a lawyer and people who can afford to hire a lawyer do. And this is where we really need to think about a paradigm shift. We need to think about strong systemic infrastructure for both civil and criminal legal services. We're a little bit better in the criminal legal services because the public defense services, because we do have the strength of some case precedent behind us. But when it comes to the dignity and fairness and leveling the playing field, we really need to think differently about how we manage public defense legal services and provide them. And the last sentence, when it comes to representation in court on matters that involve human rights, this is the reference to fundamental interests, basic human needs, and I'm lumping them under human rights. And we're going to talk a little bit about human rights and the lens of human rights here. And I've got a quote there from a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And another little aside to the biography page for me leading into this. They asked me about my favorite book and my favorite podcast, I think. And when I think about favorite, I think about what's my favorite enjoyment, and so I picked Shalimar the Clown, Salman Rushdie. He's just an awesome writer. Wallace Stegner is another favorite, but overall, that was, that's a book I truly enjoy and I could characterize as a favorite. But Thomas S. Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions was a book I was introduced to in high school. And I've carried it with me all my life. I've still got my 1970s copy. I won't dig it out here and show it to you because it really changed. It changed my my view. It changed the way I think and look at things, because it talks about scientific revolutions, and how scientific revolutions can encompass relatively fast changes in viewpoint. The Copernican revolution, you know, when we moved from, was the Earth the center of the universe? Was the Earth flat or round? These were huge changes in viewpoint that changed everything. It changed the way we looked at everything. It changed the way we started to proceed down almost every path. And we can move it up. Newton's law, all the laws of science, as we discover them and we realize what they are, it changes the way we look at things. And those are paradigm shifts. And so we make decisions about things that we're going to do depending on the lens that we're looking through. And we really need to change the lens that we're looking through when it comes to the right to counsel, not even just from a constitutional basis, but through the lens of human rights. Cultural lenses lie at the heart of the systemic biases and inequalities that we are facing right now. And if we can change our perspective and think a little bit more about human rights, fundamental interests and basic human needs, if you will, then I think we can, we can start to think very differently about how we go about systemic change. And then this slide, there's a lot of information on this slide. This is the, a PowerPoint nightmare kind of a slide, but there are just such important ideas here. And these are some things that are relatively new to me. I was actually doing a presentation on human rights. We were actually looking at the Flint water crisis, and the idea that fresh water, the access to fresh water and safe water is a human right, but it's not necessarily a constitutional right. And how can that be? The United States has no consistent or clear policy on human rights. It is, to be fair, a relatively new concept. We know about it most in the aftermath of World War II, when we were truly facing human rights crises, and when the war was won, we had to start thinking about how we were going to make sure that the genocide and the Holocaust were never allowed to happen again. Generally, we think about human rights in terms of foreign policy. But we still have this resistance to adopt it. President Jimmy Carter was probably the first president to really express a policy of pursuing human rights as part of his executive policy. I put a quote in from Cyrus Vance shortly after he was the Carter administration was in place. Our concern for human rights is built upon ancient values. When we think about our history and the founding of our country, these are ancient values. And it looks with hope to a world in which liberty is not just a great cause, but a common condition. And this was the way that they were defining human rights. And he advanced 3 features of human rights to aspire to. And I've highlighted the second one: the right to the fulfillment of such vital needs as food, shelter, healthcare, and education. These are the basic human needs that the Civil Gideon movement looks at. And then when in reference to that, he talks about recognizing that the fulfillment of the right will depend in part on the stage of the nation's economic development. But we also know that we need to act, and we need to act without corruption, and we need to act without indifference to the plight of the poor. We really need to concentrate on the underserved, underprivileged, marginalized communities in order to shore up their reliance on the United States supporting human rights. And the fundamental difference, as I see it, is that constitutional rights are enumerated rights. They're defined in the body of the Constitution and in the Bill of Rights. They're specified enumerated rights. And human rights are a wider, more fluid idea, and a wider, more fluid concept. So when we, in our jurisprudence, when we think about rights and constitutional rights, while we may sort of think that they are, oh, these are human rights, they're actually very specific enumerated rights. And we need to, again, this is the idea of we need to shift our lens and start thinking about constitutional rights being human rights. That's what the founders meant. That's what this is all about, is trying to further human rights, because that's how we further cultural equity. And this is that's the paradigm shift that we need. And this is just a note, you know, we'll come back around to the courts, and the idea that if we are coming into court, we're late. We're late to the game. Things could have been done perhaps to interdict the need, to put us on an off ramp, again, to coin a phrase, to keep us out of the courts. And when it comes to especially when it comes to the protection of fundamental interests and basic human needs or human rights, we really need to think about what we can do to keep people out of the courts. Make the courts the last resort when it comes to making the decisions about what they need. The bullet there, triage leads to more harm than good. What happens very often in our courts, especially in courts that are dealing with fundamental issues, whether be they criminal, be they civil legal services, especially where there is no lawyer, they're very often important interests that need to be reviewed, that need to be settled. And our courts are burgeoning, our courts are overwhelmed. And very often what happens in the courts is much more triage than it is resolution. We think about it in the public defense world when it comes to funding public defense, when it comes to the allocation of resources. We very often find ourselves doing triage. We look at what's the most serious case, what's the most winnable case, you know, what are the cases that we can actually do something, make a difference on, and those are the ones we focus on, and others kind of get lost. And that is not doing the kind of good that we need. That's not using the courts the way they should be they should be used. We need to find a way to help people before they get into the courts. We need to level the playing field. Safety nets exist, but we need to find a way to help people get the benefit of those safety nets. My idea there is to create a system, an infrastructure of publicly funded community-based offices that can advise individuals as their legal rights. And then the next refers to the idea that there are governments and agencies and officials that are there to help. For example, departments of social services that are there to help people if they need help with housing, if they need help with food, if they need help with medical care. They can go into a social services agency. Part of the problem is those agencies and those officials cannot advise people as to what their legal rights are. They can only walk people through whatever the protocols are in applying. And if a problem arises down the road, then those people actually become the adversary in court. Those people actually have information that is used against a person who has been seeking help. So we can't say that you know, people can go into social services and get help, because they can't get advice as to their legal rights. And very often that's what they need. They need to be able to go to a place like a legal aid society that isn't going to turn them away because they can't afford, you know, this person doesn't meet an income level, or they just don't have enough, and they have to pick and choose the cases that they can help. There has to be a place where people can go in and sit down with somebody who is knowledgeable and who has their particular interests that they can look at and they can advise. And they have to do it without conflict, and they have to be able to do it confidentially. And that's a lot of the activism that has to take place that will hopefully keep us out of the courts. Because if we can do that, if people know what their legal rights are, a lot of times they can avoid legal problems. And then the last bullet there, human rights activism is about street level bureaucracy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a book called Street Level Bureaucrats, or street level bureaucracies. And the idea here is that people who are working boots on the ground to help people, for example, social workers, public defenders, civil aid lawyers who are trying to help. We are in many ways, we're part of a bureaucracy, we're part of an agency, we're part of a structure, but we are making the moment by moment decisions on what we might be able to do to help any particular person at any given time. And that's the triage, right? And the street level bureaucrats are the ones who can identify the problem, see what needs to be done, and may or may not be able to help. And when they can help, they very often do. When they can't, that's when the legal problems arise and there's nowhere perhaps for someone to go for that kind of assistance. And so now we move into the activism part. I'm sorry, I'm taking a lot longer than I was going to, but like I said, I can stay.
We did have one question pop up while you're talking on the last slide. Are there public defenders involved in the Derek Chauvin, George Floyd case, the most conspicuous court case at present? I
do not believe so. I think he is represented by private counsel. And I can't be sure. I haven't really looked to see who's representing him, but I believe that he is represented by retained counsel, not the public defender system. And yes, that is, that's a case that carries with it. The eyes of the world are on that case. And in many ways can be tied into to this next little topic on crisis lawyering and movement lawyering. These are kind of new. I'm just learning about these. I've just been doing some training, getting some training on crisis lawyering and movement lawyering. These are about meta level responses to and transformative ideas to work within the court system to make the changes that we need. Very often, if somebody needs a lawyer, they're in crisis. And the lawyers need to respond, but more and more we're seeing huge crises. The Flint water crisis required lawyers to come in and try and determine what laws were in place to help them make the fix, what laws were in place to protect people, what laws were in place that might be able to bring about some change. We saw in Texas after the storm. A crisis that was just, if you'll excuse the expression, a clustermuck of problems, and trying to sort out who is responsible for what, and how do we protect the community? How do we protect the individuals? The community, because entire communities were left without services. Individuals, because the individuals were getting slapped with these huge power bills, and many of them didn't even have the power. And so crisis lawyering is, I think it's a newly defined discipline where the lawyers are coming in, and they're coming in as teams, and they're trying to define what the issues are. Where do we have to go to fix them? What if we are going to be in the courts, what is it we need to, what are the issues that are going to be arising in court? Movement lawyering is in many ways the Black Lives Matter movement is tied up with lawyering. It's tied up with public defense. It's tied up with the representation and the protection of people who are, victims of mass incarceration, victims of the criminal defense system as a social order. And both aspects of these disciplines inform the development of systemic relief. And at the bottom, I put, for example, the right to counsel at first appearance in New York. We have a right to counsel in New York, constitutionally mandated by the federal constitution, the state constitution. We have statutory mandates, and yet people were not getting lawyers when they first appeared in court the way the law said they were. So there was a lawsuit. The New York Civil Liberties Union took on a lawsuit. They represented 5 counties. They sued the state. There was actually a settlement because the attorney general and the system realized, yes, you're right. We need to figure this out. And there was a huge money settlement for the 5 counties. And the neighboring counties, sort of said, hey, what are we? Do we have to sue in order to get proper resources for our public defense systems, county-based systems? And so 2 years later, the law was expanded that we need to fund public defense in the criminal arena, throughout the state. And that was done through movement lawyering. That was done by the identification of a crisis and a class action suit that went into the courts and got us a result. And what's perhaps the real shame is that the same laws apply, the same statutory law applies to the right to counsel in family court cases. And yet the Harrell-Herring settlement and what they call the Harrell-Herring expansion law do not cover, have not covered funding in family court for family court lawyers. We did get some money in this year's budget, we're very proud to say, with a push. But that, this is sort of a new thing to watch and perhaps a new thing to think about if you want to get into lawyering and crisis lawyering and movement lawyering. And I put this in because in terms of reimagining and paradigm shifts and the things that we, that we want to see change, this was something that was written in 2009 from an article on reimagining criminal justice. And it's so relevant today because with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the changes, with the idea of defunding the police, which is, maybe not the best slogan, the best motto for something. In New York, the governor's executive order required all of the police agencies and all of the counties and jurisdictions in the state to reimagine policing, to come up with new plans. And the idea, if you've had a chance to look at this, public safety shouldn't just be about how many police are on the corners and who's getting arrested for what. Public safety really is, it's a community effort, and it's about making community living robustly defined, a condition of life in which people are free to come and go without victimization or the fear of victimization. And that victimization can happen in the civil and the criminal arenas. And it really does require the mobilization of assets within our communities in order to redefine and reimagine how we're going to bring about social justice and how we're going to defend and protect it in the courts. So what do? These are just some ideas in terms of, the students who are here, embrace your education, enhance your critical thinking, remember who we are. I put that in there because I really think we need to work hard to reject the anti-intellectualism, which has become a bit of a movement in itself in this country. We shouldn't be about celebrating ignorance. We need to embrace and celebrate education and critical thinking and reimagining our world in order to become the strong nation that we were intended to become. The Constitution is a living document. I know that there is a movement out there that doesn't believe that. I soundly believe that the Constitution is a living document and we can use it to better ourselves. And become a street level bureaucrat, become somebody who is working boots on the ground to help people. And the more street level bureaucrats we have, the more people we can help, the fewer will get lost in the shuffle. And when I say, if they don't change, we run for office and we bring the change or we sue. I don't mean to be flippant there, but as in Harrell-Herring versus New York, sometimes a lawsuit is the only way to get bring about the change. When I do presentations like this, I like to share some of the books that I look to for inspiration. Some of these are older, some of these are brand new, but they're all definitely worth it. The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, I mentioned. Letters and Essays in Search of a Better World, Karl Popper and his vision of an open society. Albert Camus is just fantastic. John Lewis, we will miss him dearly. Street Level Bureaucracy is that book that I talked about, dilemmas of the individual in public service, and it talks about what it means to be working boots on the ground, trying to help people within the structure of an agency that may have, its own policies, and the street level bureaucrats are actually the ones making up their minds. The Sum of Us, Heather McGee's new book is fantastic. If you have a chance to read it, I just got it over the weekend and I could barely put it down. The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History, Samuel Moyne. He's got another new book out. He's really examining human rights. He's examining them in the sense of what do we mean, how they have changed, whether we're talking about sufficiency at a minimum level of human rights or whether we're talking about equality and more economic equality and what is the best way to define human rights and further them. Parallels and Paradoxes, Explorations in Music and Society. This was a book I found last summer. Daniel Barenboim was a prodigy pianist. He's and a conductor. He's an Argentinian Jew. His family moved to Argentina as part of the Russian diaspora in the 40s. Edward Said was a Palestinian authority, was born in the Palestine Authority. That was before Israel was established as a nation, and then he and his family went to Egypt. And Said ended up at Columbia University, and Barnboim ended up at the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. And they met when Barnboim and his orchestra came to New York through a mutual friend who said, "You two have to meet." And they met and became fast friends and world changers. And the two of them, between the two of them, they created an orchestra called the West East Devon Orchestra. And it's made up of young people, young musicians from the Middle East, from all over the Middle East. And the idea was, if they could bring all of these young people together with their instruments and they could learn how to play this fine music, that they would overcome some of their barriers and they could learn, a new path forward. It was a grand success, and so that book. It carries some of the philosophy of how we can find different ways to further cultural equity and cultural understanding. On the Run: Fugitive Life in American City, Alice Goffman did her baccalaureate. I think she did her bachelor's, master's, and PhD by living with families on the margin in Philadelphia. And it's really a fascinating study of what it means to be living on the margin in this country. Closing note from one of the greatest minds in liberal thought: democracy is not the law of the majority, but the protection of the minority. And that's the true goal of an open and free society. That's how we further cultural equity. And we got 2 minutes to 8. And I wanted to do a little short reading from John Lewis, if everybody is okay with that. It's from the book that's on the list, Across That Bridge. And he writes, "The most important lesson I have learned in the 50 years I have spent working toward the building of a better world is that the true work of social transformation starts within. It begins inside your own heart and mind, because the battleground of human transformation is really, more than any other thing, the struggle within the human consciousness to believe and accept what is true. Thus, to truly revolutionize our society, we must first revolutionize ourselves. We must be the change we seek if we are to effectively demand transformation in others. It is clear that the pot is being stirred and people are beginning to breathe in the essences of change that will lead the soul to act. Who will emerge at the forefront of this struggle in the 21st century? Perhaps it will be you."
Thank you, Stephanie. This is incredible. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Lisa. Okay, I'm going to open the chat. Let me see.
Nothing new in the chat yet. I just love,
okay. We've got everything that came through.
Yeah, my initial thoughts that I jotted down right at the beginning were just, thank you for bringing up trauma-informed care. I think that's really important and something we don't hear enough in a lot of fields. I was telling you last night, I've done work with folks with disabilities, and one agency did a great job with training with trauma-informed care and one agency didn't. And I just think it really helps you think about other people's perspectives a little bit more. And it really helps with, folks getting de-escalated. And then also I appreciated that you talked about some intersections of identity, and said, you specified I'm focusing on economics, but a lot of other kind of isms link in there. And I just think that's a really important note to make. So I appreciate that, but I'm just glad you're here, and I'll mute myself so other folks can speak up. Kiana has her hand raised.
Yeah, go ahead, Kiana.
Hello.
Hello, Kiana.
I'm gonna put my hand down. Thank you so much for doing this talk. This has been really interesting for me. I've been doing homework, but I kept getting pulled back into the conversation. And I just found it really fascinating. For me, I knew about the undocumented part because that's what I'm doing for my thesis, but
I'm sorry, say that again.
I was saying I like knew about undocumented people not having the right to legal counsel
Okay.
because that's what I'm doing for my thesis. But I
Nice.
wanted to ask, what role do you like all the different views that you had for the history? I mean, for the future of legal representation. What role do you think, particularly undergraduate education like Wells, and then the role that law schools would have in kind of shifting the, I guess, national mentality away from like punitive measures and more towards like, I guess, community-based and like supportive kind of preemptive measures before having to get to the law? That was a really long question.
That's okay. And I appreciate it because I want to say a lot of the work that needs to be done in order to bring about a true paradigm shift is not going to happen in the law schools. I mean, we are going to need good, energetic lawyers to take on legal services while we, as we move forward, and hopefully ultimately as we provide more legal services for people, we'll need them less. And we need good, enthusiastic lawyers to take on some of the movement lawyering and the crisis lawyering. But a lot of the work that we need to be done has to be done through evidence-based social science research. Wells taking the liberal arts path and learning about social sciences, learning about research, learning about all of the underpinnings of society and culture and community, and then finding areas where we can do research, data-driven research. That is how we are getting into court and showing and helping our clients. For example, both the Drug Law Reform Act, when we dropped the rock, when we changed the Rockefeller drug laws, and the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, were both driven by evidentiary research that established that the violations of drug laws and the use of incarceration was not helping in any way to end the drug problem, to end the drug crisis. And we are still seeing that. Luckily, we managed to make that shift in New York and get a lot of the people out of prisons. But that was data driven by social scientists. And the same with the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act. It took decades of research to establish that people who are victimized, people who suffer interpersonal violence and victimization, might find themselves on either side of the courtroom. They might be a complainant trying to be protected from an abuser, but they might just as well be coerced or defending themselves against a coercer, their abuser. They might find themselves tied up into some criminal conduct that they wouldn't be there if it weren't for the abuse that they suffered. It might be that they have a lifetime history, a childhood history of trauma that went untreated, that they weren't able to develop appropriate coping skills, and somehow they wound up in the trouble that they're in. And when we finally got the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act enacted, it was because we finally convinced the legislature that yes, this is huge. You've got, and it's mostly women, but it's not just women, because men are abused as children. They are abused among themselves. But there are people in prison because they killed their abuser, and it was determined, well, you should have left, right? How come you stayed? Well, now we know a little bit more about why people stay. We have in our DVSJA resentencing cases, we have parasite cases. We have cases where people, people may have killed a parent because of abuse that they suffered was suddenly triggered into new conduct. Into offensive conduct. And we took that research and we persuaded the legislature to allow us these resentencings. And now we are in court and we are trying to convince prosecutors and judges that this is righteous. Everybody thinks, oh, I understand domestic violence. Well, maybe we don't understand domestic violence, especially if we're asking how come they didn't leave. Why do they have this residual problem, right? So this is where the social sciences and the evidence-based research are incredibly helpful. And you can almost pick a topic like your dissertation, your thesis. If it's about the representation of non-citizens, whether it's in the removal courts or elsewhere, it's this kind of research that's going to arm the lawyers. So if law school is your goal, think about an area where you might want to further a legal argument, and then think about the evidence that you need in order to do that. And maybe you want to go that route, Maybe you want to think about, I might want to go look into social work. I might want to look into interpersonal violence. I might want to look into almost any, the repercussions of the opioid crisis. So many of the things that we need to establish, how poverty impacts conduct, how poverty impacts coping skills, how any sort of marginalization can impact what decisions a person is able to make. And that's where when we talked about my interests in trauma-informed advocacy is related to, in representing clients, talking to them and exploring what potential trauma they may have had in their lives that impacted the pathway of their life. And if we can identify what that is, maybe we can find, if we can't find exculpatory evidence or, information, if we can't find something that will get them off entirely, that they're not responsible because that happened, we might be able to say, but it's mitigating, right? We can't hold them to something that they may have engaged in if there is another broader systemic problem that underlies how they got where they are. So in terms of, what can you do at Wells? What might you do after Wells? Whether it's law school or whether it's graduate school in a social science, we need to bring it all together, because that's how we're gonna do the paradigm shift. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. Thank you. That was very beautifully said.
Kiana is super involved at Wells, and I just messaged her and said, do you want me to give you Stephanie's email address? Because
Absolutely.
That seems like that makes a lot of sense. So
in fact,
yeah. I'm like, you're a good connection to have to talk out some ideas.
Here, I can put it in the chat.
Lisa has her hand raised. Go ahead, Lisa.
Need to unmute. Stephanie, I could listen to you for hours, frankly. I'm just, you've touched on so many things that I feel passionate about, but I come back to, as I have a lot during the pandemic, of thinking globally and acting locally, and wonder, I'm class of 78, but I was only on campus for a year, so you and I didn't overlap. And I've spent what time I've spent with people, if you will, during the pandemic has been with our local food pantry, and both mostly in person, but somewhat financially. How can I, at 64 years old, and chances are I'm not going to law school, nor am I going to pursue a master's in social work at this point. Though, thank you, Spencer Hildahl, I might pursue a master's in sociology. I
love Professor Hildahl.
Oh my God, it changed my life, Spencer Hildahl. Anyway, how can I act locally, aside from giving money to the local, there's in New York City, ACLU. I have several good friends who work in this arena. One who was actually the director of, I think it was Law and Justice for the ACLU, and now he's working for a different organization. I like to be involved, and when I say that, I want to feel like there's something I can do, and yes, handing people bags of food, encouraging others to volunteer with the food pantry, encouraging others to give to the food pantry is something I can do. In the realm of social justice, in the realm of the lenses you talk about, how can we act locally?
You know, there's, if you can get out into your community and look around, there are, you know, there are especially faith-based activist groups, activism groups. There's other activism groups. You know what I would say, maybe where you could do the most good, even though it seems limited, is mentoring. Find a mentoring program, whether it's in a, you know, it's part of a school program, whether it's part of a faith-based program, whether it's part of a, you know, another civics program. It's huge to be able to offer your help to a young person who may not be able to have the resources or the wherewithal to find them in other places in the community. And I think what I might start doing, you know, if you just to look, and I can help you if you let me know where you are and what you're interested in. But part of me thinks that if you were to Google, you know, mentoring programs in wherever it is you want to be able to do it.
Yeah, I'm in Lower Westchester. I'm essentially in New York City suburb.
Okay.
I live in Larchmont, New York.
Oh, okay. And you know, I can reach out to my colleagues, the defense programs, in Westchester, and see if they have some ideas on what you know, what activist groups there may be. I got a funny chat here. Did you guys get this direct message cannot be read?
I sent you a private message.
Oh.
I was trying to sneak
I put my email
on another call.
Okay. Hey.
All right. So you're Emily's still here, and yes, I'm sorry. I just I overbooked. Thank you so much.
I didn't know it was telling me that, you know, my that it didn't come through. Hey, thank you for everything.
It was me.
Thank you.
I'll talk to you later. Thanks, everybody.
You're stephb@rochester.rr.com. Okay.
stephb@rochester.rr.com.
Okay. No, I would love to know ways to be active. I'm not in a position to give major funding to any organization, you know, including our local food pantry. And we are so fortunate that we've gone from a food pantry that was serving clients twice a month, give or take 400 bags of food, and we've moved to every Tuesday and delivering well over 900 bags of food. Wow. Not delivering, distributing. And that includes about 100 home deliveries. And this is not Meals on Wheels. I mean, this is, food delivery for people to cook, and that doesn't even take into account some of the homeless population, which have different, they can't prepare carrots in a pan. And in fact, in most cases, there's a lot of things we can't give them because apples are too hard for them to eat with lack of dental care. It's a very frightening. And
your head is certainly in the right place, that you are cognizant of all of this. You know, you could even check out a homeless shelter and go and find out if there's, whether you can do something for them or with them, or whether they even have some ideas on what might be done to help them.
My church is extremely involved in a lot of these programs, including Midnight Run.
But mentoring is just, that really is, that's one young person, two young people, that we can help, and each one of us can help and teach them things, right? Because that's so much of the marginalization is based on people just simply not knowing how to move within our culture. That's what privilege is. We know the cues, we know the language, we know what needs to be done. And a lot of people who don't grow up in those, in that situation, they just don't understand what it is they need to know, what it is they need to, what it is they need to be able to communicate, how they can find something.
I've been working at the food pantry for months now, or a year at least now, and I've been fascinated. A young woman, and I'm sure you can all appreciate this, who I was working with on my team, and because I'm a distribution captain, and she goes to fairly local Catholic school. We're talking one day and I said, oh, do you live locally? You know, you're trying to find, you know, oh yeah, I know your next door neighbor or whatever. And she said, no, I live in the Bronx. And I said, oh, you know, what brought you to, you know, the Large Mountain Mamaroneck Hunger Task Force? And she said, it was a link on my school's website. And I thought, how brave of a junior in high school to click on that and say, I can do this without, you know, dragging her best friend. You know, it's like going to the bathroom, you know, at a fraternity party, right? You know, it's like, come on with me. I mean, that she came on her own.
Wow.
And I was so wowed by her, and I still am wowed by her. And but we've talked a lot, and I'm gobsmacked by how relatively, and I use that term very purposefully. What's the word I'm looking for? Ignorance is not the right word. Not, you know, really not clued in, even in terms of the college process. When the other teens I'm working with are all from Larchmont and go to Mamaroneck High School and have a whole different college guidance situation. And, you know, I've spent a lot of time with them and say, well, you know, there could be this connection, or in this group of people working here, there's somebody who, you know, used to teach at the college you're looking at, or whatever. It was just that relatively minor social distance of not having parents who attended college. And I just,
It is. You know, where I am, I'm out in Central New York, in rural Central New York, and I know that Wells is getting more and more first generation students. And in fact, they even got that TRIO grant. I hope I got that right. That if you don't know the process, if you're not familiar with it, right? When I talk about knowing my privilege, I know my privilege. I understand how easy it was for me to sort of step on and move forward, because there were just so many things that were natural to me. And when I started to meet my clients, and I was one of those privileged white people who assumed that when I started talking to them, they know what I was talking about. And when I realized they didn't, and I had to really back up and say, okay, you know, that's okay. And start with real basics and walk them back up through. We could make great strides in working through cases, but and that was, you know, unfortunately in the defense arena, but also it started to inform, you know, this idea of trauma-informed advocacy and
Right.
And marginalization, and how it impacts where people are going to find themselves in the structure. And the more we can get in and teach young people about some of these cues, and then the easier it will be for them to find a path, and they can help each other, because if we help one, they will help too.
One of my fatal flaws as a development officer in several independent schools is that, you know, I am sure that the expectation was that I would continue to cultivate the young alums whose parents had been our major donors. You know, I wanted to talk to the kids who were first gen private schools, who were, you know, on full financial aid, because they had parents who had no college, who didn't know about building even a resume or how to make contacts. And that was my focus. Totally my focus was the alums who didn't have a scintilla of privilege, and how to make connections for them with other alums to, you know, et cetera. Anyway, you and I could do this like for the next 10 hours, and I'm hogging too much airtime.
Like I said, I love to carry my my soapbox around and talk with anybody who's willing to listen.
Does it fit in a tote bag so you can put it in your car and just?
I just got a new tote bag to carry my soapbox around in.
Excellent. Thank you so much. This is amazing.
Hey, Steph, it's Mary.
Hi, Mary.
Mary Gregory Hardy.
Yep.
You're a clown. And I've kind of fallen into being a mentor for a refugee. I started doing a Girl Scout troop. I thought I'd retired from Girl Scouts, but but for a independent school in Hartford, Connecticut, that they seek to bring kids out of poverty through education. So it's a totally free And one of those kids really just called me and wanted to do something else with me, and we've stayed together. She's in 9th grade now, and I'm just like amazed at the things that she doesn't know that are just, it just strikes me all the time of how privileged I am. Just things like silly things, but it brought her to our house and and opened the garage door with push of the button, and she was like, well, how did that happen? And because she had never experienced anything like that, and so my desire is really to give her more experiences so that because the intention is definitely that she'll go to college, but she'll be absolutely first generation. Her parents speak Korean, and not much English, but she's a fluent in English. So I guess, it seems like a small thing to do. It's just one person, but I feel very called to do that.
Good for you. And I love that you use the word called. It really it can be a calling, and it's so fulfilling to be able to do that. And it really is like tossing a pebble into a pond, and the ripples that we can do when we can help, even if it's just one person. And we take so much for granted. And that is maybe the hardest thing. That's the biggest lesson that we have to learn when it comes to when we talking about racism, talking about all of these different things. It's to make everybody, all of us, look in the mirror and say, what are the things that we know because of our privilege? And that's what we mean when we think about privilege.
And we don't even I don't even understand it fully, what privilege is. It's like that little instance was such an eye-opening experience to me. Of course, everyone knows that you can just open your garage door.
Yeah, and not everybody does.
And I'd like to be able to help all kinds of people, but I guess I have to sort of be satisfied helping one person or moving one person along.
And that's that was the other side, when Emily was talking in the beginning, my interest in trauma-informed advocacy and secondary trauma, compassion fatigue. We want to be activists, we want to do what we can, but we should, we should only take on what we can, do what we can, be kind to ourselves when we can't do it all, because every little thing that we do makes a difference. And the more we do, the more we can bring somebody in. And like I mentioned to Lisa, you help one, they'll help their friends, right? They might say, hey, come meet my mentor, because I bet you she can help you answer that question. Or she'll say, hey, guess what I learned today from my mentor, and share it.
The other area that I'm very interested in, which you just touched briefly, is those with disabilities. They are so marginalized, and if they're people with autism, they can't navigate it, and I'm not even sure that they can even necessarily help someone else. It's a huge area that we as a society need to deal with.
And another place that we don't necessarily think about, to be free of that kind of disability, or to the extent that we may start recognizing some of them, for those of us who grew up in the before times, we may be learning more things about ourselves and how we manage to overcome, and we can find maybe kinder, gentler ways to overcome them. But we really do. We make a lot of assumptions about what people can and can't do without really knowing what they can and can't do.
Right.
Mary, you and Stephanie together have touched on so many things that I'm struck by. The kids, I call them kids, as far as I'm concerned. Anybody, forgive me, Emily, anybody under 50 is a kid at this point. But the kids that I worked with at, as I said, 3 different schools. And what school, Mary, were you talking about? Is it New Haven or Hartford?
Hartford, Grace Academy.
Okay, I'm not familiar with it. I worked at Worcester School in Danbury for 4 years. I'm struck by the division, if you will, of the young people who really appreciated the opportunity. And Stephanie, you went to Emma Willard, I think, or I thought Emma Willard. You know, we all know there's a population of students who are, you know, basically full financial aid, and those who are found a way to appreciate that opportunity, and the ones who have left with a huge chip on their shoulder because they weren't part of the well-to-do crowd. And I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to bring some with a chip on their shoulder back into the fold. But I have watched exactly what Stephanie has said, where those who have made great strides have turned around and said, how can I help you?
Yeah.
Been where you are, how can I help you?
Private education is, you know, such an odd place. I came from, you know, the soundly middle class with a British mother who firmly believed in private education. And so we all went to boarding schools, and Emma Willard happened to be the school that my brother Bill actually said to my parents, she should go to Emma Willard, because he knew somebody, you know, he'd met a girl.
Where
right?
did he go to?
He started at DeVoe in Niagara Falls, and then it closed his junior year.
Right.
And he graduated from Harley, a day school in Rochester. He actually ended up coming home for his senior year.
He had a fraternity brother named Bruce Allspack.
Yes.
Okay, so
he was Delta Chi at Union.
Trust me, I know. Trust me, I know this. I partnered with your brother. Bruce's wife, or Bruce's widow, is one of my closest friends. Was maid of honor at my wedding, which is how I met Bill, was because Joyce and Bruce were dating before they got engaged, got married. But I'm so, have you seen the Atlantic article about private schools?
I don't know that I have, no.
It's that private schools in the United States are obscene and shouldn't exist.
Oh, that would be,
yeah, I'll send it
Are
to
being what?
That they're obscene. That they're charging tuition and then expecting annual fund. And, you know, I was a fundraiser, an alumni fundraiser for private schools for over 20 years. Right now in this pandemic, I can't imagine, and forgive me, Emily, and I'm not talking about colleges, I am talking about independent schools, pre-K through 12. I can't imagine asking alums who are not already part of the parent group or have other connections to finance, you know, to send me $25 a year or $50 a year when there's so much need right in front of everyone in their own communities. It's just not something I can, you know.
Yeah, it's an interesting dichotomy, and that's, you know, when I
will always give my $25 a year to Rye Country Day, and I gave more when I could, and I gave more when I was an employee there. But because I do think it's important to stand up and be counted at whatever level. But right now, I mean, that's gilding the lily in my mind.
And a lot of them have the alumni who can help them do what needs to be done, right? And we have to hope that they're not necessarily
you more than Rye Country Day, honey. Yeah, I know.
That one.
I don't mean you. I meant Emma Willard.
Yeah. Emma Willard was my introduction to fabulous, borderline obscene wealth. Had no idea. You know, I was such you know, middle class rural girl, country girl, going to Emma Willard. Looking back, I truly recognize the extraordinary education I had. And then I came to Wells, and, you know, and it just, you know, it became even grander. But I remember when I went to Emma Willard, this is how naive I was. I was in school with girls who had last names that were companies, and I had no idea, right? I went to school with Chase's, and they were Chase Bank. I went to school with a Bristol of Bristol Myers. I went to school with a Mars of Mars Bar Company.
Listen,
who the hell knew that Mars bars were named after a rich person, right? Just this ridiculous obscene wealth.
A couple of years ahead of me at Wells, we had Debbie Craig of Craig Electronics, which nobody knows anymore unless you're like older than I am. Their whole